5 days. That's all it took for a fairy tale wedding to become a nightmare that would haunt a young man forever. But before I tell you about the dark secret that shattered everything, let me show you how a chance encounter at a luxury charity auction changed 2 lives in ways no one could have predicted. This is the story of Jake Morrison, a 27-year-old struggling artist who thought he'd found his salvation in the arms of Victoria Ashworth, a 75-year-old millionaire with a smile that could light up a room, and secrets that could destroy a soul. What happened in those 5 days will make you question everything you think you know about love, money, and the lengths people will go to protect their past. Here's what you need to know right now. By the end of this story, you'll understand why sometimes the people who save us are the same ones who destroy us. And the twist. Victoria's dark secret wasn't about her money, her past, or even her age. It was about Jake himself. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal will make you see this entire story in a completely different light. I'm going to tell you this story in 3 parts. First, the magical beginning that fooled everyone, including Jake. Second, the 5 days of marriage that seemed too good to be true, because they were. And finally, the devastating truth that broke a young man's heart and changed both their lives forever. But before we dive in, ask yourself this. How well do you really know the people you love? Keep that question in mind, because Jake was about to discover that sometimes the people closest to us are complete strangers. Let's begin. Before we start this incredible story, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and let us know where you're watching from around the world. Your engagement helps us bring you more amazing true stories like this one. Enjoy your story. Jake Morrison was drowning. Not in water, but in debt, disappointment, and the crushing weight of dreams that seemed further away each day. At 27, he was a talented artist with paintings that nobody wanted to buy, living in a studio apartment in Brooklyn that was more studio than apartment. Picture this, a space so small that Jake's easel took up half the room, and his bed was literally a mattress on the floor pushed against the wall. The smell of oil paint mixed with instant ramen was basically his signature scent. But Jake had something that money couldn't buy. Genuine kindness, the kind that made elderly neighbors bring him homemade soup and children stop to watch him paint on street corners. Every morning, Jake would wake up to the same routine. Check his bank account, wince at the numbers, then spend 20 minutes on the phone with his mother's doctor's office, trying to figure out payment plans for her cancer treatments. His mom, Linda, was everything to him. She'd raised him alone after his father disappeared when Jake was just a baby. And now she was fighting the battle of her life while Jake could barely afford his own groceries. Jake's art was beautiful, don't get me wrong. He painted portraits that captured not just what people looked like, but who they were deep down. The problem was, nobody wanted to pay for that kind of truth. He'd been rejected by every gallery in Manhattan, told his work was too emotional or not commercial enough. But here's what made Jake different from every other starving artist in New York. He never got bitter. When kids would stop to watch him painting in Washington Square Park, he'd let them help mix colors. When his elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen couldn't afford groceries, Jake would share his ramen, even when it meant he'd go hungry later. The night everything changed, Jake was working his 3rd job of the week, serving drinks at a fancy charity auction in the Upper East Side. He'd been hired by a catering company, wearing a uniform that cost more than his rent, watching rich people bid thousands of dollars on things he couldn't even pronounce. His feet were killing him, and he'd been dealing with entitled guests all night who treated him like he was invisible. During his break, Jake stepped outside for some air, still wearing that ridiculous bow tie, when he noticed an elderly woman sitting alone on a bench. She looked sad, staring at nothing, and something about her made Jake stop. He didn't know why, but he walked over and asked if she was okay. He didn't know it yet, but this kindness would be both his greatest strength and his most dangerous vulnerability. Jake's life was about to change forever at that charity auction. But when this elegant older woman approached him during his break and said the words that would alter his destiny, he never could have imagined what was coming next. Her first words to him weren't a drink order or small talk. They were, "Your mother painted that same scene 40 years ago. I bought it for $50,000. Victoria Ashworth was everything Jake wasn't: wealthy, established, connected to a world he'd only seen in movies. At 75, she moved through high society with the grace of someone who'd never known want, never felt the sting of rejection, never had to choose between buying paint and buying food. But here's the thing about Victoria. She wasn't just rich, she was smart rich. The kind of woman who'd built her fortune through real estate investments and tech stocks before most people even knew what the internet was. She wore designer clothes like they were everyday outfits, and when she walked into a room, people noticed. That night, when Victoria told Jake about his mother's painting, his world tilted. His mom had never mentioned selling any artwork, let alone for $50,000. Jake barely remembered her painting at all. She'd stopped when he was little, claiming she didn't have the talent for it. "Your mother was Linda Morrison, wasn't she?" Victoria said, and Jake's heart nearly stopped. "She painted a beautiful landscape of the Hudson Valley. I bought it at a small gallery in 1984. It's been hanging in my study ever since." Victoria invited Jake to sit with her, and for the next hour, they talked about art, about his mother, about dreams that seemed impossible. Victoria didn't talk down to him or treat him like the help. She asked real questions about his paintings, about his techniques, about what inspired him. "I'd like to see your work," Victoria said as the evening wound down. "Would you mind showing me your studio sometime?" Jake almost laughed. His studio was basically a closet with good lighting. But something in Victoria's eyes told him she was serious, so he gave her his address, never expecting to see her again. 3 days later, Victoria showed up at his building in a car that probably cost more than Jake would make in 5 years. She climbed those 4 flights of stairs to his tiny apartment without complaining once, and when she saw his paintings lined up against the walls, she went quiet for a long time. "These are extraordinary," she finally said, and Jake could tell she meant it. "You paint like someone who understands pain." That afternoon, Victoria bought 3 of Jake's paintings for more money than he'd ever seen in his life. Enough to pay his rent for 6 months and make a dent in his mother's medical bills. But more than that, she gave him something he'd been missing, someone who believed in his talent. Over the next 3 months, Victoria became Jake's patron. She introduced him to gallery owners, art collectors, people who actually had money to spend on original work. She'd call him up and invite him to dinner parties where his paintings would somehow end up being the topic of conversation. Suddenly, Jake's work was selling, and for the first time in his life, he could breathe financially. But Victoria saw something in Jake that even he didn't see. Not just talent, but a purity of spirit that reminded her of someone she'd lost long ago. Someone whose memory still haunted her dreams and drove her to make choices that would seem incomprehensible to everyone else. The weird part was how much Victoria seemed to know about Jake's life. She knew his mother was sick before he'd told her. She knew about his struggles, his dreams, even little details like how he took his coffee. Jake figured rich people had ways of finding out about people they wanted to help. But looking back, it should have been a red flag. For 3 months, Victoria became Jake's patron, buying his paintings, introducing him to collectors, changing his life in ways he'd never dared to dream. But on the night she invited him to her Hamptons estate for dinner, she showed him something that would explain everything and nothing at the same time. A room in her mansion that she'd kept locked for 40 years. And inside that room was a shrine to a young man who looked exactly like Jake. The Hamptons estate was like something out of a movie. 12 bedrooms, an infinity pool, gardens that went on forever, and art worth more than most people's houses. Jake felt completely out of place walking through those marble hallways, but Victoria treated him like he belonged there. Dinner was perfect, the kind of meal Jake had only seen on cooking shows, served by actual staff in a dining room that could seat 20 people. They talked about art, about books, about travel to places Jake had only dreamed of visiting. Victoria was fascinating, the kind of person who'd lived 10 lifetimes and had stories about everything. After dinner, Victoria took Jake on a tour of the house. Room after room of luxury, each one more impressive than the last. But when they reached the 3rd floor, Victoria stopped in front of a door that was different from all the others. It had multiple locks, and Victoria's hands shook slightly as she opened them. "I've never shown this to anyone," she said quietly. "But I think you need to see it." The room was a time capsule. Everything from the 1980s, posters, furniture, clothes still hanging in the closet. But what made Jake's blood run cold were the photographs. Dozens of them, all showing the same young man. A young man who looked exactly like Jake. Same brown hair, same green eyes, same slim build, even the same way of smiling. It was like looking at pictures of himself in clothes he'd never worn, in places he'd never been. "This was Thomas," Victoria said, her voice barely a whisper. "My son." The young man in the photographs was Thomas, Victoria's son who had died in a car accident at age 27, the same age Jake was now. The resemblance was uncanny, unsettling, and it explained everything about Victoria's sudden interest in his life. Thomas had been an artist too, Victoria explained. Not as talented as Jake, but passionate about creating beautiful things. He'd been killed by a drunk driver on his 27th birthday, coming home from his first solo art show. "I've kept this room exactly as he left it," Victoria said, tears streaming down her face. "For 40 years, I've come in here every day to say good morning and good night to my boy." Jake didn't know what to say. The resemblance was impossible to ignore, and suddenly Victoria's interest in him made sense in a way that was both touching and deeply uncomfortable. That night, Victoria made Jake an offer that would solve all his problems. Marriage. Not for love, she said, but for companionship, for purpose, for the chance to give each other what they both needed. She would pay for his mother's medical treatment, set him up for life as an artist, and in return, he would simply be there. Be the son she'd lost, the future she'd been denied. "I know how this sounds," Victoria said. "But I'm not asking you to love me as a husband loves a wife. I'm asking you to let me take care of you the way I would have taken care of Thomas. Let me give you the life he'll never have." Jake stared at those photographs of Thomas, seeing his own face reflected back at him, and felt like he was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. Victoria was offering him everything: financial security, artistic recognition, a chance to save his mother's life. All he had to do was say yes to the strangest arrangement he'd ever heard of. What Jake didn't know was that Victoria Ashworth had been watching him for months before they ever met. She'd hired private investigators, studied his routines, learned about his mother's illness, his financial struggles, his kind heart. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was a carefully orchestrated plan. But here's where the story gets dark. Because Victoria wasn't just looking for a surrogate son. She was looking for something much more specific, something connected to a secret she'd kept buried for 40 years. A secret about how her real son had actually died. The wedding was small, elegant, and confusing to everyone who knew them. Jake's friends thought he'd lost his mind. Victoria's social circle whispered about gold diggers and late-life crises. But for 5 magical days, none of that mattered. Jake's best friend Marcus pulled him aside before the ceremony. "Dude, what are you doing? This woman is older than your grandmother. Are you really going to marry someone for money?" But Jake tried to explain what Marcus couldn't understand. This wasn't about money, at least not the way people thought. Victoria needed him, and he needed her. It was unconventional, sure, but it felt right in a way that Jake couldn't put into words. The ceremony took place in Victoria's garden, with just a few close friends and family members. Jake wore a suit that cost more than his car, and Victoria looked radiant in a simple but elegant dress. When they exchanged vows, they weren't promising romantic love, they were promising companionship, care, and mutual support. Jake's mother Linda was there, looking healthier than she had in months thanks to the treatments Victoria had paid for. Seeing his mom smile, really smile, for the first time in ages made Jake feel like he'd made the right choice. Victoria showered Jake with everything he'd never had: designer clothes, expensive art supplies, a studio in her mansion where he could paint without worrying about rent or bills or whether he could afford groceries. She introduced him to her world, taking him to gallery openings and charity events where he met artists he'd only read about in magazines. The studio Victoria set up for Jake was incredible. Floor-to-ceiling windows with perfect natural light, every type of paint and brush he could imagine, canvases in every size. It was the kind of space he'd dreamed about but never thought he'd have. "Paint whatever makes you happy," Victoria told him. No more worrying about what will sell or what galleries want. Just create. For the first time in his adult life, Jake felt like he could breathe. His mother's cancer treatments were covered, his bills were paid, and he could focus entirely on his art. Victoria was generous but not clingy. She gave him space during the day to work, and in the evenings they'd have dinner together and talk about books, art, and life. Jake started painting some of the best work of his career during those 5 days. Pieces that came from pure joy instead of desperation, colors that seemed brighter because he wasn't painting in a room that smelled like ramen and disappointment. Victoria seemed genuinely happy too. She'd light up when Jake would show her a new painting, and she'd tell him stories about Thomas that made both of them laugh and cry. It felt like they were healing each other in ways that traditional therapy never could. But there were weird little things that didn't quite add up. Victoria seemed to know details about Jake's childhood that he'd never shared. She knew he was left-handed before she saw him paint. She knew he was allergic to shellfish before they went to dinner. Small things that could be explained away, but they added up to a feeling that something wasn't quite right. But on their 5th day of marriage, Jake discovered something that would change everything. Hidden in Victoria's desk, he found a letter addressed to him, dated 3 months before they'd ever met. A letter that revealed the real reason she'd chosen him. And the truth was more twisted than he could have ever imagined. Jake found the letter by accident. He'd been looking for stamps to mail a painting to a collector when he opened Victoria's desk drawer. The envelope was thick, expensive paper, with his name written in Victoria's elegant handwriting. But the date made his stomach drop. It was dated 3 months before they'd ever met. The letter was from a private investigator named David Chen, detailing not just Jake's background, but his psychological profile, his vulnerabilities, his deep need for a mother figure due to his own mother's illness. Victoria hadn't fallen for Jake's kindness, she'd weaponized it. The report was thorough and invasive in a way that made Jake feel sick. It detailed his daily routines, his financial struggles, his relationships with friends and family. It analyzed his personality, noting his compulsive need to help others, and his deep-seated abandonment issues stemming from an absent father. But the most disturbing part wasn't that Victoria had manipulated him into marriage. It was the reason why. Because Jake wasn't just a replacement for her dead son, he was chosen for a specific purpose that had nothing to do with companionship and everything to do with revenge. The report included details about Jake's mother that even Jake didn't know. Linda Morrison hadn't just been an artist, she'd been involved with someone significant before Jake was born. Someone whose identity had been carefully hidden for 27 years. Jake's hands were shaking as he read further. The investigator had done DNA research, traced family histories, and uncovered connections that went back decades. Victoria's interest in Jake wasn't random, and it wasn't just about his resemblance to Thomas. That evening, Jake confronted Victoria. He found her in Thomas's room, sitting in the chair she used when she came to visit her son. "I found the letter," Jake said quietly. Victoria didn't seem surprised. She looked at him with those same kind eyes that had drawn him in months ago, but now they seemed different. Calculating. "I was wondering when you'd find it," she said. "I almost wanted you to." "Why?" Jake asked. "Why did you do all this? The investigation, the manipulation, the marriage. What's this really about?" Victoria stood up slowly, walking to the window that overlooked her perfectly manicured gardens. "My son didn't die in a car accident, Jake," she said. "He was murdered. And you're going to help me get revenge on the man who killed him." Victoria's son Thomas hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered. And Victoria had spent 40 years planning the perfect revenge against the man who killed him. The man who was now Jake's biological father, a father Jake had never known existed. The truth was devastating in its complexity. Jake's mother Linda had been Thomas's girlfriend 40 years ago. They'd met at art school, two young dreamers who thought they could conquer the world with their creativity and love. But Linda had been seeing someone else at the same time, an older man named Robert Chun who was possessive, jealous, and dangerous. When Robert found out about Linda's relationship with Thomas, he flew into a rage that ended with Thomas dead and Linda fleeing the city. Your mother was pregnant with you when she left, Victoria explained, her voice steady but her hands shaking. She never told anyone who the father was because she was terrified of what Robert might do if he found out. Jake felt like the world was spinning around him. His father, the man he'd wondered about his entire life, was a murderer. And his mother had been keeping this secret for 27 years. Robert killed my son in a fit of jealous rage, Victoria continued. Beat him to death with a baseball bat outside the apartment they shared. But he was smart about it, made it look like a robbery gone wrong. The police never had enough evidence to charge him. Victoria had spent 40 years obsessed with getting justice for Thomas. She'd hired private investigators, followed leads, spent millions of dollars trying to track down Robert Chen. But he'd disappeared after Thomas's death, changed his name, gone completely off the grid. But here's what Robert didn't know, Victoria said. Linda was pregnant. And I knew that someday, if Robert was still alive, his guilt would drive him to search for the son he'd never met. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Victoria had been monitoring any searches for Jake Morrison, any attempts to find Linda Morrison's son. She'd been waiting for Robert to surface, and 3 months ago, he finally had. He hired his own private investigator to find you, Victoria said. And that's when I knew it was time to put my plan into motion. Victoria had intercepted Robert's search, gotten to Jake first, and set up the entire relationship. The charity auction, their chance meeting, the months of patronage, all of it designed to draw Robert out of hiding. You were never meant to be my son, Jake, Victoria said. You were meant to be bait. Jake stared at this woman he'd married, this woman he'd trusted, and realized he didn't know her at all. The kindness, the generosity, the apparent love, it had all been part of an elaborate trap. What happens now? Jake asked. Now we wait, Victoria said. Because Robert is coming. He's been watching us, following the news of our marriage, and his desperation to meet his son is going to bring him right to us. And when he does... Victoria opened a drawer in Thomas's desk and pulled out a gun. When he does, I'm going to make him pay for what he took from me. Victoria hadn't married Jake out of loneliness or even manipulation. She'd married him to lure his father out of hiding. Because Jake's father, Thomas's killer, had been searching for his son for decades, consumed by guilt and desperation. And Victoria was counting on that desperation to finally get her revenge. The meeting was arranged for the same charity auction where Jake and Victoria had first met. Victoria had received a message from Robert through an intermediary. He wanted to meet his son, and he was willing to come out of hiding to do it. Jake felt like he was living in a nightmare. In the span of a few days, he discovered that his entire marriage was a lie, his father was a murderer, and he was being used as bait in a 40-year-old revenge plot. I won't be part of this, Jake told Victoria the night before the meeting. I won't help you kill someone. You don't have to help, Victoria replied. You just have to be there. Be yourself. Let him see the son he's been searching for, and let his guilt do the rest. The charity auction was the same glittering affair Jake remembered from months ago, but now it felt different. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he also knew that if he didn't show up, Victoria would find another way to draw Robert out. At least this way, maybe he could prevent someone from getting killed. Jake's father, Robert Chen, was now 68 years old, a broken man haunted by the mistake he'd made in his youth. He'd spent 40 years running from what he'd done, changing identities, living in constant fear of being discovered. But the guilt of killing Thomas and abandoning his pregnant girlfriend had eaten away at him like cancer. When Robert saw Jake across the auction room, he broke down immediately. The resemblance to Thomas was unmistakable, but there was something else too. Jake looked like Robert had at that age, before anger and guilt had twisted his features into something harder. You're my son, Robert said when they finally met face to face. It wasn't a question, the DNA was written in every line of Jake's face. I know, Jake replied. I know what you did too. Robert didn't try to deny it or make excuses. He told Jake the whole story, how he'd been obsessed with Linda, how finding out about her relationship with Thomas had driven him into a murderous rage, how he'd spent every day since then wishing he could take back those few minutes that had destroyed so many lives. "I've been looking for you for 15 years, Robert said. "Ever since I got sober and realized what I'd thrown away. I wanted to find you, to try to make amends somehow, to at least tell you that I was sorry." Victoria appeared beside them like a ghost. She'd been watching from across the room, and now it was time for the confrontation she'd been planning for 4 decades. "Hello, Robert," she said quietly. Robert's face went white when he saw her. He recognized Victoria immediately, Thomas's mother, the woman whose life he'd destroyed along with her son's. "Victoria," he whispered. I've wanted to apologize to you for so long." 40 years too long," Victoria replied. Her voice was calm, but Jake could see the rage burning in her eyes. The three of them stood there in the middle of the charity auction, 3 people bound by tragedy, love, and hate, each carrying secrets that had shaped 40 years of pain. But Victoria's revenge wasn't what anyone expected. She didn't want Robert dead or imprisoned. She wanted something far more cruel. She wanted him to watch her destroy the son he'd been searching for, just like he'd destroyed hers. And Jake realized he was never a husband. He was bait. Victoria's plan was more twisted than Jake had imagined. She didn't just want to kill Robert. She wanted to destroy him psychologically first. She wanted him to experience the same helpless agony she'd felt when Thomas died. "You took my son from me," Victoria said to Robert. "So I'm going to take yours from you." Victoria had prepared legal documents that would effectively make Jake her prisoner. With his financial dependence on her, his mother's medical bills, and carefully crafted contracts he'd signed without reading, Victoria could control every aspect of Jake's life. "He'll live in luxury," Victoria said, "but he'll never be free. Never be able to leave, never be able to make his own choices, never be able to become the man he was meant to be. Just like Thomas will never get to become the man he was meant to be." Robert fell to his knees right there in the middle of the auction. "Please," he begged. "Punish me, not him. He's innocent in all this." "So was Thomas," Victoria replied. Jake looked at these 2 people who had shaped his life without him even knowing it. His father, broken by decades of guilt, and his wife, consumed by decades of hatred. Both of them had let their pain turn them into people they probably never meant to become. In that moment, Jake faced an impossible decision. He could walk away from everything, the money, the security, the chance to help his mother, and preserve his dignity. Or he could stay and become complicit in Victoria's revenge against a father he'd just met but somehow still loved. But then Jake did something that no one expected, something that would break the cycle of hatred that had consumed 2 generations. He chose a third option, one that would require the greatest sacrifice of all. "I forgive you," Jake said to Robert. "For killing Thomas, for abandoning my mother, for not being there when I needed a father. I forgive you." Then he turned to Victoria. "And I forgive you too. For lying to me, for using me, for trying to turn me into a weapon in your war. I forgive you both." Victoria stared at him in shock. "You can't forgive him," she said. "Not after what he did." "I can," Jake said. "Because holding on to this anger is what's been killing both of you for 40 years. Thomas is gone. Nothing we do here is going to bring him back. But we can choose not to let his death destroy any more lives." Jake pulled off his wedding ring and set it on the table between them. "I won't be your prisoner, Victoria. And I won't be your redemption, Robert. I'm going to be my own person, make my own mistakes, and build my own life. And if you both want to be part of that life, you'll have to figure out how to let go of this hatred that's been eating you alive." Jake walked away from everyone. From Victoria's money, from his father's desperate need for forgiveness, from the easy answers and the complicated revenge. He chose to forge his own path, carrying the weight of everyone's mistakes but refusing to let them define his future. The next few months were hard. Harder than Jake had ever imagined. Without Victoria's financial support, he was back to struggling, back to worrying about his mother's medical bills, back to wondering how he was going to pay rent. But something had changed in Jake during those 5 days of marriage. He'd learned that he was stronger than he'd thought. more capable of standing on his own than he'd ever believed. His art took on a new depth, informed by the complex emotions of discovering his true family history. Jake's mother Linda was devastated when she learned the truth about his father and about Victoria's manipulation. She'd kept Robert's identity secret to protect Jake, and now she felt like her silence had made everything worse. "I should have told you," she said through her tears. "You had a right to know." "Maybe," Jake said. "But you made the best decision you could with the information you had. That's all any of us can do." Linda's cancer went into remission, partly due to the treatments Victoria had paid for and partly due to her relief at finally being able to tell the truth about Jake's father. Victoria tried to contact Jake several times, offering him money, apologizing for the deception, begging him to come back. But Jake never responded. He'd meant what he said about forgiveness, but forgiveness didn't mean he had to put himself back in a toxic situation. Robert also reached out, wanting to build a relationship with the son he'd never known. Jake was more open to this, but on his own terms. They met for coffee once a month, slowly building something that might eventually become a real father-son relationship. It wasn't easy. How do you love someone who's capable of murder? But Jake was committed to breaking the cycle of abandonment that had defined his family. 6 months later, Jake stood in a small gallery in Brooklyn, looking at a painting he'd completed just weeks after leaving Victoria. It was a portrait of 3 people bound by invisible chains, a young man, an elderly woman, and a broken father, all reaching for something they'd never be able to touch. The painting was called Forgiveness, and it had sold within hours of being displayed. Not because it was pretty or decorative, but because it captured something true about the human condition, our capacity for both terrible harm and incredible grace. Jake's work was selling again, but this time on his own terms. He'd found a small gallery that appreciated his emotional honesty, and collectors were starting to notice his unique voice. He wasn't rich, but he was free, and that felt more valuable than all of Victoria's money. This story isn't about a young man who married for money or an old woman who bought love. It's about how the sins of one generation can poison the next, and how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to play the game at all. Jake never saw Victoria again, but he heard through mutual contacts that she'd finally gotten some therapy and was trying to process her grief in healthier ways. Robert continued to struggle with his guilt, but he was attending AA meetings and trying to make amends to other people he'd hurt over the years. Jake's paintings now hang in galleries across the country, each one exploring themes of family, forgiveness, and the courage to start over. His latest series is called Breaking Chains, and it deals with the ways trauma gets passed down through generations and how we can choose to break those patterns. And his mother? Linda recovered completely, and she started painting again for the first time in decades. Her new work is vibrant and hopeful, full of the joy she'd rediscovered in finally being free from her secrets. Jake still thinks about those 5 days sometimes, about the life he could have had if he'd stayed with Victoria. The financial security, the artistic recognition, the luxury he'd never experienced before or since. But he's never regretted his choice to walk away. Because Jake learned something in those 5 days that no amount of money could teach him, that real freedom isn't about having everything you want, it's about choosing who you want to become. And sometimes the most important choice you can make is to refuse to let other people's pain become your prison. If this story affected you, if it made you think about the cycles of revenge and forgiveness in your own life, please hit that like button right now. It really helps this channel reach more people who need to hear these powerful stories. And I want to know, what would you have done in Jake's position? Would you have taken the money or chosen your integrity? Drop a comment below and let's discuss it. I read every single comment and love hearing your thoughts on these complex situations. If you're new here and you enjoyed this deep dive into human psychology and relationships, please subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss these incredible true stories. Your support means everything to me and helps me continue bringing you these life-changing narratives. And here's something really important. If you know someone who's struggling with family trauma, toxic relationships, or cycles of revenge in their own life, please share this video with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is choose to break the chains that bind us to other people's mistakes, and this story might be exactly what they need to hear.